welcome. I'm super curious to know who has my first book, Medicinal Plants of the Pacific Northwest. We were chatting with some people beforehand. Awesome. Who's eaten something off of a plant that they directly picked off the plant before? Great. Who has eaten a wild thing that they picked in the wild off of a plant before? Lovely. Who's been huckleberry picking before? Awesome. Who's picked something other than huckleberries in the wilderness before, the wild? Give me a shout out. What have you harvested? Salmon berries. What else?
Mushrooms.
Blackberries, mushrooms.
Thimbleberries.
What berries?
Thimbleberries.
Thimbleberries, yum. Nettle, what else?
Rhubarb.
Elderberry, what?
Rhubarb.
Rhubarb, yes. What else?
Chanterelle.
Black caps. Oh, that's in my book. I love those. We have a lot of those where I live. Awesome. So this book is all about foraging. It's all about harvesting edible plants in the wild, and we're going to get into it a little bit. I got different topics. I kind of just choose what I want you guys to know. It's a little bit of a selfish talk, so here we go. I always forget to introduce myself, so I always have to make a slide to remind myself to, I figured somebody maybe is curious. This is me and my sibling and my dad. My dad's actually right there. So there you go. I was raised not in the wilderness the whole time, but we went out and did a lot of hiking and backpacking and skiing. And that's kind of where this whole passion began for me, is just being outside a lot. And then when I was 19 years old, I took a 3-month-long trip in Japan. And it was a pretty crazy trip, but that's kind of where I first foraged for wild foods. In case you didn't know, Japan has a very strong wild food culture. You can get wild foods at the grocery store in Japan. That's pretty common. You can also get a lot of wild foods on your buckwheat soba or on your ramen, which is fun. In this picture, I'm holding a Japanese spikenard root that I harvested on a small island in North Japan. And that was actually on a different trip to Japan. And then here I am with a host family. I stayed on organic farms. And farmers are the best foragers, right? Because they have all these fields and forest land that they can harvest on. And so that's kind of where I had my first foraging experience with foraging mugwort, Japanese knotweed, violets, and all those things. And I was just lit up by that. I love eating, and I love cooking. I love interesting flavors. And I'm an herbalist, of course, and I kind of got interested in that for health reasons. But the wild food kind of just became a love of the idea of going outside and being able to just know what to eat. And maybe is anybody attracted by that idea? That's why you're here? Yeah, it's such a cool idea. And actually, I don't have a slide for this, but it's a really interesting concept. Could you survive in the wilderness? And to be honest, with the amount of wild foods we have at any given time here, probably not. Isn't that weird? You probably want to learn how to hunt, because especially unless you're in a wild food rich environment, like the Camas prairies, for example. Wild food is kind of a little bit more scarce than you'd think. If you've seen the show Alone, you probably know that. Really, people who were hunter-gatherers, they spent all year picking, preserving, drying, burying, canning, cooking, steaming, and all the things to in certain seasons. And it's kind of it's a big job, right? So it's interesting to think. But it is cool to go out in the forest as somebody who knows a lot about plants, and I see it's like being surrounded by your friends. Even though I know maybe I'm not going to survive more than a couple days out there, based on what I see. I'm always taking stock. I'm all right, we got our dandelion root over here, and then we got some glacier lily over here. I could eat that if I really needed to, if I got stuck out here. I'm definitely thinking about that. But to me, it's cool to just go outside and you're just surrounded by friends. You're oh, hey, what's up? I've seen choke cherries in a while. Last year I harvested some. This year, last week, I harvested choke cherries. It's kind of also introduces this ritual into your life. Every year I harvest choke cherries from the same spot, and I get to know that spot, and I look forward to going back the next year. I'll do some pictures of the choke cherry harvest from this year. Anyway, and then so at some point I decided, and actually very early on in my plant career, I decided I wanted to teach because I thought this was so cool, somebody else might think it was cool too. And I like hanging out with people obsessed with plants, so that definitely was the thing. So I've been teaching since 2016 full time. So what is that, almost 10 years. I'll have to have a party next year, that'll be fun. So in case you don't have my first book, these are visual guides. And to me that was I didn't want to just write another foraging guide because there's plenty of foraging guides out there. Like my whole point in writing these books was the photography and the showing of very detailed plant parts. So if I had just written, and actually I was too lazy to do this on one slide, but if I just written the names of these, you'd look at it and your brain probably wouldn't absorb it at all, right? But you look at this, and do you recognize any plants on here? What do you recognize? Salmonberry. What else? These are chokecherries. Yeah, which is something that West Side folks don't know as much about. Any of the other ones you recognize? Anybody that has a lawn might recognize this. Hairy Cat's here. Yeah. What about this guy right here? Japanese knotweed. Yeah. Does anybody have that in your yard? Yeah, that's kind of a whole thing, isn't it? But you can't eat it. It's in my book. And then this one's an interesting one too. This is big leaf maple flowers, which is also in my book. So that's a fun spring harvest. And these actually are all pictures directly from my book, by the way. And so both of them are visual guides, and they're both set up really similarly. And was told that this is also for sale today, so if you don't have that, feel free to grab a copy here. I'll sign either one of them at the end if you'd like. So I kind of wanted to start out with the number one thing that I personally have gained from foraging, as somebody who's been foraging kind of for my whole life. My mom and I would go pick blackberries since before I could remember. You know, we get suited up in our like long sleeve, like thick jeans and gloves, and we're the kind of blackberry pickers that would take like a board out there to lay on the blackberries, and like even like a ladder, and we'd go home with heaping buckets of the things. So I've really been foraging for a long time, but when I got into it, I think it's been like 17 years of being really obsessed with this topic. And something that I really love about this is that it forces you to slow down, because this is last week. My husband and I have e-bikes now, and we go e-bike foraging, and it's great because we have panniers and we fill them up with berries and apples and nuts and all the things. But normally, like, we're on the bike path and people are just whizzing past us on their bikes, and 2 different people asked us, like, are you guys okay? Because we're stopped. Like, you don't do that on bikes, apparently. You're not supposed to stop on the side of the path. And the things that you are able to see when you slow down and stop, like when you're picking berries, when you're in the bush, one of these things was a praying mantis. Actually, this was the second praying mantis on the same trail. I saw one the week before, but this was on the same trip. And it's one of those things that I wouldn't have seen. It blends in so well. It's landing on an Oregon grape branch. If I was just whizzing past my bike, I never would have saw that. And there's so many times when I'm out foraging and like a deer comes up, because I'm like quiet and I've been there for a while, and the deer doesn't know I'm there, and then suddenly I'm like, we both kind of like look at each other and we're like, oh. Or a really cool bird comes by. My mom's really into birding, and so she's been teaching me about birds, and I see all kinds of cool birds when I'm picking the berries, because birds like berries too. And it's kind of this like secondary benefit of this slowing down, and suddenly you get this deeper knowledge, right? And there's something about deep knowledge to me that makes me feel really satisfied in my soul. I think in a culture where we have access to all the things all the time, it's hard to go deep now. Right? We have like Instagram is like the ultimate shallow thing, and I still do look at Instagram, but I think that now more than ever, this type of deep relationship with place, which I think foraging is one window into, is super important, and it's super satisfying, and I think can be really healing for our mental health in this moment. So I really hope that you go out with my book and are able to open that door for yourselves. So of course, in every presentation I give, I have to give a little like, what do you harvest right now? Right? If you wanted to walk out the door right now. Does anybody notice the color theme on this? Isn't that interesting? Like, this is where fall colors come from, right? And these are all pictures of things you could harvest right now. Again, do we recognize anything? Yes. Apple, yeah, which I did include in my book. I know it's not technically native, but feral apples are everywhere, and they're almost like my favorite thing to forage. Does anybody recognize these things in the bottom corner? I'm trying to get out of the way, but it's really hard. It's not huckleberry. Hawthorn. Also not native, but very abundant in our area. What about this guy right here? Rosehip. Yeah, and those are kind of late. There's kind of a mix of different stuff. Chokecherry is like right now. Dock seed is right now. So I'm going to go into some of the things specifically. You guys recognize this? Have you seen this in the park? Or like, this is a weed, right? A lot of people pull it out. They get really annoyed by it. The seeds are edible. The leaves are also edible, but I prefer to eat the seeds. It's kind of like buckwheat flour. So you pull this just like this. This is actually my mom again. Pulling the dock seeds off of here. You toast them, you grind them, and you can put them in pancakes. It's really awesome. It's one of the few like wild seed flour sources that we can find here, especially that's so abundant and it's a weed. I really, in this book, I emphasized weeds a lot because we kind of come into this time where like people are scared, oh, we're gonna harvest like all the native plants and we're gonna kill them all and then there's not gonna be any more native plants left, right? Which I think there's a little bit of alarmism there, but I think that's like a reasonable fear, right? Like foraging is really trending right now, so like let's pick weeds first. And that's kind of was a big theme in this book, is like weeds are abundant, people are usually gonna chop them down anyway, right? So you might as well make use of them. Hawthornberry is also considered a weed. I think last I checked, the city of Seattle considers them to be a noxious weed, in fact, and actively tries to eradicate them. But they are also edible. I will say, hawthornberry is one of those edible plants that only an herbalist would recommend to you because they're not tasty, actually, by themselves. Like if you cook them, they get tasty, right? You add some flavors, you make your hawthorn chutney, right? But it's not the hawthorn that is providing the yumminess of the hawthorn chutney. But the cool thing about hawthorn berries is that they are a cardiovascular tonic, and they're actually one of the most researched medicinal plants in the world, partially because there's a lot of species of hawthorn that grow all over the world, including in China. I found hawthorn berries in Turkey, hawthornberry jam in Turkey. We have different species of hawthorn. This is the most common. So like most parks, most wild areas, imagine like that kind of field with grass and like some shrubbery. That's where you're going to find hawthorn. Sometimes you can find them in forests too, but they're not going to fruit as much in a forest. And they've got these little star-shaped things on the bottom. If you've looked at the bottom of an apple, you might recognize that pattern, and it's because they are related. They're both in the rose family. A lot of rose family plants are going to have, this is actually the sepal of the flower that's remaining after the berry gets ripe. Here's another one. This one's not going to be out yet because this is a cold and wet weather plant. Does anybody recognize this from their garden or their lawn or the park? Chickweed. These flowers are really tiny. They're like smaller than a dime. This is my favorite wild edible green, hands down. You can eat it raw, you can cook it. It's super abundant. You can plant it in your garden. It's like not a super aggressive weed, so it's not going to take over. It really likes manure piles. If you want really good chickweed patch, just throw some manure on the ground, chuck some chickweed seeds in there, and it'll have a heyday. And it's amazing the amount of chickweed. You can make pesto out of this. Chickweed pesto is really delicious. I think there's actually a chickweed pesto recipe in my first book, but you can just make pesto but replace whatever it is with chickweed. And if you do encounter chickweed in the fall, I've harvested this in November in your lawn, and I put it in the Thanksgiving salad and didn't tell anybody. Yeah. One of the ways, it has some lookalikes, some of which will be found in pictures in my book, but you want to give it the tendon test. And basically what I've done here is I've pulled apart the stem, and there's kind of like a pipe-shaped outer stem, and then this inner stem is stretchy, like a tendon. And that's one of the ways that you know that it is chickweed and not one of the lookalikes for chickweed. And so in my book, there'll be lookalike sections. Of course, I haven't included every single lookalike, but I've tried to include the ones that are obviously, things that look like it that might not be good for you to harvest. Like scarlet pimpernel is in there. So those are the three things, just backing up. We got our dockseed, we got hawthornberry, and we got chickweed. But there are other things. Apple season's coming in right now. We just harvested our first apples. I've got apple scrap vinegar going. I've got dried apple slices going. We just harvested chokecherry. I'm going to make chokecherry jam. Recipes in the book. Chokecherries mostly grow on the east side of the Cascades, if you're curious about where to find those. If you ever go on trips to Montana or North Dakota, there's a lot of chokecherries there as well. And then rose hips are going to be a little later in the fall because they need a little bit of a frost to get the sugars to start producing in the plant. Same with rowan berries as well, also known as mountain ash berries. Also not the tastiest berries, and therefore something you should put in a jam with lots of sugar. And that is what the recipe is in the book. But also something that likes a little bit of frost. If you eat it before the frost, it's going to taste absolutely horrendous. You notice also when birds eat things, if the birds aren't touching it, they might not be ready, right? They have good taste. Just like goats. If the goats aren't eating it, it's probably not edible. Another thing that you should know about wild foods is that they are not domesticated, right? So often some level of preparation needs to happen. Either there's toxins in them and we need to boil them out, or maybe just a bad flavor like a bitterness. Like dandelion greens, for example, are most traditional cultures that consume dandelion greens will boil them. They do not eat them raw, which is interesting. And so that's kind of removing the bitterness. In Japanese, they actually sell a specific product that's just like lye, basically, in a box. And they call it akunuki, which means like take out the poison. And it's for certain plants that need to be soaked in lye, like fern shoots. And they soak that overnight. There's actually a picture on the box of a fern shoot. Just to give you an idea of, like, in Japan, how much wild food is part of the culture. That's just like a normal grocery store find that you'd find at any grocery store. Nettles, of course, also need to be processed with gloves. You know, harvesting them takes a lot of the sting out of them because the stings will like kind of break and then like give their little juice up. But they still will sting you after you've been harvesting them. This is me peeling a Japanese knotweed shoot. This is kind of like a you need to peel rhubarb kind of thing. Some people don't peel rhubarb. I'm a rhubarb peeler. I don't like all that weird fiber stuff. So I'm a Japanese knotweed shoot peeler as well. And things get fibrous like later in the season as well. So there's all these kind of considerations for wild foods that, you know, are part of traditional cultures that have traditions around these things that I think a lot of us weren't brought up with. And so that was something that in my book I really made sure to deliver on for all the plants to make sure that people are preparing these things correctly. One time I was on a hike and I passed this man who was breaking off fresh bracken fern shoots and just like popping them in his mouth, just like chunk. And if anybody knows about bracken fern, it actually has a carcinogenic compound called, it's got a fancy name, it's like pterazine, I think. Anyway, it's carcinogenic, it builds up in your body over time, and it's most concentrated in the raw shoot. And so clearly he knew that bracken fern was edible, but he did not know that it needs to be processed. And it's interesting because it's like in the West, it's like, oh, you can't eat it, it's got carcinogens in them. But then in China and Korea and Japan, the exact same species is eaten, but they always soak it, boil it, soak it in lye. They do something, and scientific research has shown that all of those methods actually do decrease the level of that compound in them. So kind of just a moment of like, oh, we can't just eat everything raw, which is, I think, kind of an American idea, unfortunately. So I'm like, I'm here for that battle. And these are fennel seeds, so there's a lot of, also in wild foods and herbalism, there's a lot of garbling, which is basically like removing things from the stem. I spent a lot of time doing that in the fall because I put it off and put it off and put it off, and then I had piles of dried things in my house that eventually need to go somewhere. Another thing we need to think about when we're harvesting things from the wild is that we might make mistakes. It happens. I have seen, so I've taught a lot of people in my life, and I've done year-long programs, I've done little plant walks, and I can't tell you how many times I've had people literally show me a poisonous plant and be like, oh, is this mullein? Or is this elderberry? And that is actually one of the reasons I ended up going for the visual guide concept, because I was like, I need there to be no question. I need there to be no question in people's minds that this is the plant. I want them to be able to literally compare the leaf from the plant that they are harvesting from with this plant that they have in their hand and be able to tell without a doubt that it is that plant. So I chose 2 plants from my book that are poisonous plants that are really common in the Seattle area in particular. This plant is really insidious because it has red berries and it literally will grow in another plant that has red berries that are edible. Like for example, in Seward Park, there happens to be a lot of cramp bark. Okay, it's Viburnum opulus. I don't know what variety it is. And the cramp bark berry clusters look just like this, and this grows in those shrubs and produces berries at the same time, which is like so insidious. So that's why I chose this one. Thankfully, these are actually pretty easy. So again, with the star shapes on the hawthorn berries that we talked about earlier, these actually have star-shaped attachments. These are related to tomatoes, okay? You're also gonna be looking for these leaves, which are annoyingly sometimes literally just look like this, like a leaf, right? Just literally in botany, they call this a simple leaf because that is like the classic leaf shape. But it will get also various types of nodes happening there that start to look more like tomato plant, right? And even the smell is a little bit like tomato leaf smell. So when you are picking berries, please pay attention to what berries you are picking. Like, look, eye contact with the berries, have a little inspection. They have different colors, right? Different attachments, different stems, different leaves. And yeah, climbing vines especially are quite annoying. All right. I bet that some of you have seen this plant. Yeah, I saw maybe today alone, I think I saw four or five patches of this plant. I saw some on the highway on the way here. It's kind of dead and gone to seed by this point in the season, but this is poison hemlock. This is how they killed Socrates. They used to use it for basically public execution. They would feed you a cup of poison hemlock, and then you would get paralyzed starting at your feet, and then it would stop your heart and you'd die. So you don't want to eat this, in other words. This is a poisonous plant, right? This is actually a toxic plant, and this is a poisonous plant. And the difference is that a toxic plant, this might make you sick. One of my students accidentally ate some of this, not in my class, but because their gardener said they could, right? So that's a good source checking, like double check sources kind of thing. Even things in my book, please feel free to get another book to make sure that's right. Anyway, their gardener said they could eat it, and she was in the car like 20 minutes later, and she had like crazy heart palpitations after eating this plant, which makes sense because often nightshade family plants are used for heart issues in smaller doses, but don't eat the leaves, right? That's the lesson there. But this is a poisonous plant, which means that if you eat even a small amount, you will die. So this is one of those plants that you need to know if you are out foraging, especially if you're foraging for something that looks like this plant, which is why most foraging teachers are like, just don't mess with the carrot family until you're more advanced. And there's still plants I won't harvest because I'm like, I'm good. I don't want to die, right? Even though I'm like 99% certain that is what it is, it's not 100%. Whoops. And I wanted to talk about this. We got some purple spots. Has anybody heard of the purple spot trick for poison hemlock? Have you heard? So I hear some nods, yeah. Those aren't always on the plant. So I like to use this as a teaching moment to talk about using multiple identifying characteristics. And basically purple spots in general are actually a stress response from the plant, stress response. So it's responding to outward stimuli and creating this pigment, right? Sometimes it's because it's been getting eaten by a bug. Sometimes it's because it's getting lots of sunlight. There's lots of different reasons plants do that. But because different plants have different experiences and are experiencing different stressors and different levels, not all of them will produce this, right? So if it's got purple spots, definitely watch out, but that doesn't mean that all poison hemlock that you see is gonna have purple spots. So we gotta look at the leaves. We gotta look at the flowers. We gotta look at the habit. These plants get tall, really, really tall. And one thing I will say is that wild carrot, which I think is in this book, I know it's in my first book, wild carrot seeds have little hairs on the seeds, and poison hemlock seeds don't have any hairs. So there's little details like that. There's more in my book about those things so that you can benefit from them. But know your poison hemlock, start to get to know it. All right, so we're kind of moving into a different section of the presentation here, which I didn't really put a transition slide, so there you go. We're transitioning. We're transitioning into kind of like, let's respect nature part of the presentation. which is a big soapbox that I have, and they gave me this huge soapbox to talk to you about it from, so I'm going to do it. And there's a couple different things I like to consider when I'm foraging, and one of them that I have been considering more and more, as I have kind of talked earlier about like all the wildlife encounters that I have when I'm foraging, started to get me thinking more and more and more about all the different animals and plants and insects that also rely on the plants that I am taking. And so I kind of started, for this book especially, started to do my own like amateur wildlife photography. So I know that these are not professional wildlife photography pictures, but these are pictures of, like, this is a black hawthorn berry in a robin's mouth, which I witnessed. And it's like, I can't think of a better way to teach people that other things rely on the plant than literally showing them a picture of a cute bird eating the plant, right? This is, actually, I think you guys were there on this walk. I don't think you guys were there. This was in Discovery Park in November, I think. And this is also a robin eating one-seed hawthorn berries. And the interesting thing about the one-seed hawthorn berries is that, remember how I said earlier, Seattle considers this to be a noxious weed? That's interesting that this is actually a winter forage for birds, which I didn't really think about until one time I was walking in Magnuson Park and I saw cedar waxwings, like 50 of them, in a copse of one-seed hawthorn trees, just like gnawing on those berries. It's funny because the berries are kind of big for their mouths, and they just swallow them whole. So it's really important to leave some for others. And like how much detail do I share this next part in? I went on kind of like a tirade of reading all of the research on the impacts of foraging that had been done, which actually is less than you'd think. But one of the articles actually mentioned this phrase specifically, leaving some for others, as one of the phrases that a lot of the foragers, it was an anthropological article, and that one of the uniting phrases of a lot of foragers was this concept of leaving some for others, being other people, other animals, other insects, etc. Being an important part of kind of the article concluded of how foraging can exist in urban spaces specifically. Also, pollinators. I took these pictures too, by the way. I'm more proud of these ones. Birds are hard to photograph, by the way, because they don't let you get close to them. Bees are a little easier because they're like busy, They're like, you can get pretty close. This is a bee. Look at this pollen, by the way. This guy's having a successful day out in the field. Anyway, this is a chicory plant, and this is a Nootka rose, both of which you will find in my book. And flowers, like bees need them. And interesting fact about bees is they will only actually harvest pollen and nectar from one type of flower in that day. So if you were to harvest all the flowers from a field, you might be basically creating an unsuccessful harvest day for a bee. So flowers, like one thing I understand about Nootka rose flowers is that if you harvest 4 out of the 5 petals, it can still find and pollinate the flower. And you can actually tell if they've been pollinated. This has not been pollinated because the stamens are still like obviously containing pollen. Different plants will have different colors of pollen. This particular one has orange pollen, which is a little bit more of a classic color. And if these are like black, it's already been pollinated and you can just harvest all the petals. But if it's still, it's going to have the best smell if you harvest it before it's been pollinated, BT dubs. But you can harvest 4 of the petals and the bees can still find it. So there's kind of little practices like that I think are kind of fun that just have a level of respect for where you are and what you're doing. Another thing that I have been thinking about a lot recently is like how, and basically this is all like, people like to say, oh, harvest 1 in 10. And I'm like, that's not helpful. Because sometimes actually we shouldn't harvest any. Sometimes we should harvest all of it because it's invasive. Like there's so many considerations. So I'm kind of just giving you some considerations to think about. And I think as people who live in Seattle, and I actually don't live in Seattle anymore, I live in Roslyn, which has a very different population density than living here, but I lived in Seattle for many years and foraged in Seattle for many years. And I think it's important to think about how many different people are foraging in the spaces that you're foraging in. And this is kind of just to get you thinking, like, if you live here, this is going to be more of a consideration. For example, it is illegal to harvest in Seattle city parks Like, have I harvested in Seattle City parks? I have. I've literally shown pictures taken in those parks. But I think my opinion on that has changed in my career. And it's okay to have your opinion change, right? Like, I think it shows character, it shows that you're taking in new information. And I would also just encourage you guys to let that happen in your learning careers as well, is to like be willing to take in new information and allow your opinion to change. I'm getting to the point where I'm like less likely to harvest in a park, partially because I have other spaces I can harvest in. And I'm also not a subsistence forager, which, that's a whole nother controversial thing as well. But think about who is harvesting, and also pay attention to signs of other people harvesting. Like nettles, for example, you can see other people have clipped off stems in a patch. Has anybody ever actually seen that? Like they've been harvesting nettles and they've seen that? Yeah. So maybe if we have that moment when we're noticing somebody else is harvesting in the same space we are, we change what we're doing. Like maybe we don't harvest at all because that other person had a way bigger impact than they probably should have. Or maybe we just harvest a little bit from that patch, right? We find a new patch. And I think that that's going to become more and more important because foraging is trending right now, right? And I've definitely heard from a lot of other foragers and a lot of other medicinal herb people that they have seen more and more their foraging spaces being kind of over-harvested. So that's why I'm like up here on my soapbox talking about conscientious foraging. And I actually receive a lot of concerned emails from people, just like, they cold email me like, well, I saw your book and I'm really concerned that you're gonna tell people to forage everywhere and that they're gonna destroy our wild spaces, blah, 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 blah. So I guess I'm also trying to do right by those people. Like, yes, that's a little bit of a NIMBY attitude, but also like, they're not wrong, right? So let's respect our wild spaces. And I think that the best weapon against over-harvesting is just knowledge. And one of the best ways that we can go with knowledge into interacting with these plants is just starting with a few plants. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to not put 120 plants in my book, right? There's actually only 40 plants in my edible plants book. And that was a very conscientious decision because I actually chose plants that are really hard to over-harvest. So you can kind of trust. I also include like information about sustainability in each part of my chapter. Sorry, you keep making it. This is my editor right here, who's read the book like 5 times. So she's like, yep, yes, you did. Anyway, so yeah, there's information on the sustainability aspect for each plant in the book, but they're also just plants that I feel comfortable recommending to beginner foragers. And so if you want like advanced plants from other sources, like there are other places to read it. But my book is very much like, these are abundant, a lot of them are weeds, like it's an okay place to start. And on that note, best places to forage. If you have access to a yard, either your own or a family member's yard or a friend's yard, that's a great place to start because, you know 100% that it's legal to do. And like, nobody else is harvesting there, it hasn't been sprayed, or maybe it hasn't been sprayed. Sometimes it's hard to know if you've just bought the house or whatnot. Sorry, there's a little bit of a reverb happening. And then I just connected with this gal who teaches basketry. If you're interested in learning basketry, by the way, Field and Forest Crafts, Erin Cox, she's amazing. And we did a little podcast episode with her, which I haven't posted yet, but I will. And she was telling me that she harvests 100% of her basketry materials on private land. She will literally just knock on people's doors and be like, you have a really large patch of cattail in your yard. Can I harvest it? And so she has all these people that she calls that she's just completely out of the blue, like either like sent a letter to because she saw something in their yard or like, so she told me all these really cool stories about connecting with people in that way. And I was really inspired by that because I'm actually kind of shy, which I know is like weird because I'm up here and all, but like I hate knocking on people's doors. But I was really inspired by that because she's actually created this really beautiful community by doing that. And so I actually did that a little bit last year in my little town. I put on, I think, the Buy Nothing group, I put like, hey, does anybody have an apple tree? And somebody let me come harvest apples from his tree. And also he had walnuts in his yard, so I harvested some of those. So I think that like this has so much potential for being a great place to forage. It is also legal on most Forest Service land to forage. Obviously, there's a lot more people that have access to that land, so that's when you need to use your observation skills to look about what the impacts you're having are. And sometimes you need a permit. So like Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, which is the national forest that's like right beyond Seattle, you do technically need a permit to harvest there. And then there's limits on how much you're allowed to harvest. And then DNR and BLM land is really similar, and that is, I think DNR is state land. DNR and BLM are both state land. And then they have their own set of stuff, but it's usually you don't need a permit for those. You can go harvest. There's just like, don't harvest more than a gallon per day per person for non-commercial use is the typical. So those are kind of the best, most reliable places. In this picture, this is Japanese knotweed, this is the Bohemian variety, which you can see last year's shoots. See how tall that is? It's like 15 feet tall. That's a big plant. I got special permission to harvest and photograph here from Carnation Farms, which is great, and they happen to know that this patch had not been sprayed, and that's another kind of benefit of harvesting on private land with permission. A lot of farms, too, have a lot of weeds, so that's another, if you have like a friend who has a farm, definitely hit them up for foraging. Places not to forage. Wilderness areas. Foraging is definitely not allowed there. National parks. Technically, you are actually allowed to harvest berries, nuts, and mushrooms in national parks as long as you're not removing them from the premises. So as long as you're consuming them, like you're on a backpacking trip and you harvest some huckleberries, that's fine. And I actually looked at the rules. And I think that there might be some nuances between the national parks, but that's the general rule. Most city parks, it's outlawed. And then we talked about this already, highly populated areas, if we think that the whole world's harvesting there, maybe that's not where we're gonna harvest. Private property without permission seems obvious to me, especially where we live, everybody's got guns, so maybe don't do that. Sprayed areas, we'll talk about that in a second, and contaminated areas, like if you've got a local gold mine, right, or as in my town's case, coal mine, don't harvest there. A good example would be the Red Town Trailhead. I don't know if anybody's ever been there before, but there's a lot of mining in that Cougar Mountain wilderness area. And the Red Town Trailhead was actually like the center for the processing of the mine, so that's where the most contaminants are. And if you look at the introduction of my book, there's actually information on how to find out what's contaminated in your neighborhood, which is an interesting rabbit hole, I will tell you. Highly recommend it. Herbicide signs. This blue is a dye that they add to a lot of herbicides in order to basically like let the guy who's spraying know that that's where he's sprayed, and then also to let people who encounter that space later, like recently after spraying, know that it is there. So it basically looks like blue paint on the ground. Usually it'll be on like hairy cat's ear or something like that. And then plants that have been sprayed also tend to have really weird like circular or like their tops are like this. You'll see a lot of poison hemlock. Poison hemlock is the #1 sprayed thing in Seattle, second one being Himalayan blackberry. The little tops will be like this, and sometimes they kind of like create these weird circular patterns as well. And this actually is also, you can't see it in this particular picture, but it also has blue on it. And that's in the forest behind my house. This is a bull thistle plant, which is something they spray where I live. All right, so there was all that, and I think we're gonna end on this here. Let me see. Oh, I got perfect timing. I'm just gonna have a little shameless ploy to get you to plant some native plants in your yard. And here are my points, my talking points on this. All right. First of all, you can attract and feed wildlife. Remember those cedar waxwings I was talking about? I bet they would love it if you planted a black hawthorn tree in your yard. They'd probably come visit. Robins would come too. Robins are a little less exciting, but still cute. Also, growing a plant is the best way to get to know it because you get to see it in all the seasons, right? From the very first moment when it like magically bursts forth in the spring to when it like flowers to when it fruits to when it dries out or goes to seed or dies and loses its leaves, whatever. And you are like tending to this plant. So it's like this amazing relationship that you get to have. Also, you don't have to go anywhere to harvest things, which is great if they're at your house, right, or on your deck. I lived in apartments for many years when I was a forager, so I've grown a lot of things in pots, totally possible. Mugwort, by the way, if you're curious about what you should plant on your apartment deck. Coastal mugwort specifically, it's in my first book. Plants that are adapted to our climate. We're talking about native plants specifically. And then habitat continuity. Such a cool concept, okay? Camas, for example, which is really like grows a lot in the South Sound area, and also actually where I live. Pollinators and other, also for genetic diversity, love it when they can fly from this flower to this flower to this flower. And when we put a farm there, they're less likely to be able to get from here to here, from this flower to this flower. And that's kind of one of the things that is threatening a lot of our native plants is lack of habitat continuity, i.e. plants can't access other populations, or pollinators can't access other populations to spread the genetic material around, so it makes the populations weaker. But as gardeners, people with land and plants and gardens, you guys can basically put native plants in your yards and create more habitat continuity, which is so beautiful. So we can have these kind of like little conservation moments in our yards. Feel free to take a picture of this. I'm sorry if I'm in the way. I made you a list, native edible plants for Seattleites. I've lived for many years in Seattle. My parents have a yard with some of these in them. This was actually taken in their yard, this bottom right one. What a healthy, tall Oregon grape plant. It's amazing.
Is this in the book?
This list is not in the book. This is a special for you this evening only, right here. But all of these plants are in the book, but this specific list is not in the book. Wood sorrel, by the way, super easy to grow. That's what was in this picture. $12.99 a gallon at Sky Nursery. That was taken 2 years ago, I think. Evergreen huckleberries grow super good. I know somebody in Issaquah, that's where that picture was taken. Mountain strawberry, that picture was taken in my yard in Bellevue in a rental house, and now it's taken over the lawn. I hope it's still there. It probably is. It's a pretty amazing plant, very tenacious. Tall Oregon grape, if you hate gardening and you're bad at gardening, plant some Oregon grape. Pick a dry spot. It's banks plant it in their landscaping because it's so low maintenance. And it's medicinal, it's edible. Pollinators love it. It blooms in the early spring, so it gives the bees something to consume in the early spring. We love that. So many other things. We have native nurseries also. I made an extensive list in the index of my book. So if you don't know where they are, you can Google it too. It's on Google, that's where I got it. Cool, there ends my talk. In a moment, we're gonna have question and answer. I'm gonna have a moment of shameless self-promotion, and then I will answer your questions. First of all, I have a YouTube channel now, which is kind of a new thing from the last book tour that I did, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm doing this series right now called the Hands on Plants series, where I'm basically interviewing really awesome people doing awesome things with plants. I most recently interviewed Aaron Cox, who I talked about, the basket weaver. Skeeter Pilarski, who was actually my first herbalism teacher. I went out to his farm and visited him and interviewed him. This is the South Sound Prairies, Root Digger Farms. This is my friend who owns Black River Botanicals and the Hawthorne School of Plant Medicine. And this is actually Carnation Farms. We talked about livestock integration. So if you're looking for positive, hopeful content in the world, check it out. And that, by the way, is a, QR code that takes you to that place, because I'm all advanced now. And I also have videos about foraging. So if you need more visuals, you can go there. And then I also have a Patreon. And if you're unfamiliar with Patreon, it's basically a subscription thing where you pay either $5 or $10 a month. And I do monthly classes on there. I do articles. My most recent article was about berries, like kind of unique berries that you can find in the Cascades that are ripe right now. Took a bunch of pictures and wrote about them. There was also seasonal foraging guides on there. I'm working on my fall foraging guide right now. I'm very excited. I love doing photography for my posts. So yeah, that's, again, the Backcountry Herbalist on Patreon if you want to support my work and learn some things while you're doing it. Much appreciated.